Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Indian schools in both houses of parliament observed a 2-minute silence today in solidarity with Pakistan after yesterday's horrendous terrorist attack in Peshawar. This was after Prime Minister Modi rang up his Pakistani counterpart to personally express his sympathy and concern. The Prime Minister also called for both countries to join hands to decisively and comprehensively defeat terror. So how should we interpret this response from India? That's the discussion in part 2. But first, was yesterday's attack on the army school in Peshawar one more consequence of Pakistan's failure to effectively tackle the Taliban, or is it a response to Operation Zarb-e-Azab, which over the last 5 months has hit the Taliban hard, forcing this desperate attack? And beyond that, what message is the Taliban trying to send by this attack? Those are two of the questions I shall put to the world's greatest authority on the Taliban, the renowned author of The Taliban, as well as Pakistan on the Brink, Ahmed Rashid. Ahmed Rashid, let's start with yesterday's horrific attack on the army public school in Peshawar, which left 141 people dead, including 132 children. The Pakistani newspaper Dawn says several bodies were decapitated. Many of the young children were shot straight in the head. In your estimation, is this the worst massacre of children in the history of Islamic terrorism?
Well, certainly, there was an attack on a school by the Chechens in 2004 in Chechnya, but the casualties in Afghanistan and Pakistan for the last 10, 12 years, we haven't seen anything like this.
Now, the Tehreek-e-Taliban has claimed responsibility, and it emerges that they seem to know the layout of this school very well. For instance, they knew the principal's room, they knew the auditorium, they knew the canteen. Are you surprised by how well prepared they were and how carefully planned this operation was?
No, I don't think anybody's surprised, because all the major Taliban attacks have been inside jobs, in the sense that they attacked the general headquarters of the army, they've attacked the naval headquarters, they've attacked ISI offices, and they always seem to have had, it is not a surprise, but of course it is devastating to know that the Taliban's intelligence is still very great, and they have access to all these institutions.
Are you suggesting that in fact the Taliban has people who are collaborating or cooperating from inside the system, which makes them therefore all the more deadly and all the more effective? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, we know, for example, in the attack on the Karachi airport, that there were military personnel who were had given, retired military personnel who had given the Taliban information on the naval dockyard. There were ex-Navy people who took part in the assault even, and who knew the naval dockyard. And I'm sure it wouldn't have been difficult, given this huge school with all the security guards and chowkidars and people working in the school, to get information about the school.
Now, the Taliban issued a statement. It was issued by their spokesman Mohammad Khorsani, and they claim that they sent 6 attackers. But the Pakistani journalist Mariana Biber says that in fact the army has taken out 9 militants. And Dawn newspaper this morning says that there could have been as many as 16 attackers, and a few might even have escaped. Does this diversity in numbers, this range, suggest that we don't have a clear picture either of what happened or possibly also of who was responsible?
Well, I think that's very much the case. We've had now, the army has been taking journalists around the school building and showing on TV. You can see pictures of the burnt out rooms and where the explosions took place. The problem is that whether it was 6 or 9, they were all wearing suicide belts. They exploded themselves. Some of them in the midst of the students, some of them were shot by the army commanders and then exploded. So there's very little concise information. It's not like the army managed to capture one of these terrorists. They all were killed in the assault, And so it's going to take some time, I think, before all the dead bodies are accounted for and identified as to who was a terrorist and who was not. But the BBC was taken around the school building and was told by an Army Major General that there were 7 assailants. Now, again, we don't know. He was very, he didn't quite know exactly what had happened and admitted it. So I think it's going to take some time for the military to piece all this together.
Now, the Pakistani journalist Ismail Khan, writing in Dawn, says that security officials have told him that the attackers were guided from somewhere in Afghanistan by Umar Nareh, who belongs to the Tariq Gidar group of TTP. Apparently, the same security official told Ismail Khan that these attackers could very possibly have been Uzbeks. If that's true, what would that suggest to you?
Well, we know already that there are large numbers of Pakistani Taliban who've taken shelter in the border provinces of Kunar and Nuristan in eastern Afghanistan. They are linked up there with the Afghan Taliban, but also with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. So, and Chinese Uyghurs are there also in these provinces. So there's a large, and these provinces are not under the control of the Afghan government. It's a free-for-all area, very difficult terrain, etc. Even the Americans had abandoned it quite early on. Now, General Raheel Sharif, the army commander in Pakistan, has been to Kabul today, and clearly he has laid out his suspicions and fears about the Pakistani Taliban plotting and planning attacks from Afghan soil. Now, the major Taliban commander, the Pakistani Taliban commander, Mullah Fazlullah, is also based there. And this does certainly suggest something very sinister, because Mullah Fazlullah was the commander in the Swat Valley 5 years ago who ordered the shooting of Malala Yousafzai, the young Pakistani girl who last week won the Nobel Peace Prize. And the fact that Mullah Fazlullah may well be behind this attack on a school, once again, is another kind of signal that he rejects whatever Malala Yousafzai has been talking about, the need for education and girls' education and other things. So there are many elements to this factor that clearly the Taliban wanted to humiliate the army by attacking school and killing the children of army soldiers and officers. And at the same time, I think there was this continuing threat to Malala Yousafzai. And the fact that it may have been planned and plotted in Afghanistan should come as no surprise to the Pakistani authorities, because that has been happening for a couple of years now.
Now, the statement by the Taliban spokesperson claims that this was revenge for Operation Zarb-e-Azab. The statement says, and I'm quoting, "We want the army to feel our pain because they target our families." Is this a sign that the army operations in North Waziristan are hurting the Taliban and pushing them to take this sort of desperate action?
I think that is true very much. I mean, I think there are several reasons behind this. The first is, yes, the Taliban are hurting. The army is claiming that over 1,200 Taliban have been killed since June in this operation that is taking place in North Waziristan. Now, the Taliban say that most of the casualties are civilians, and most of them are our women and children. And so one can clearly see a connection here with the Taliban trying to kill so many children of army officers and soldiers, wanting revenge and retaliation for what they have been suffering at the hands of military bombardments and other such things. I think, the other important factor is that the Pakistani Taliban are very fragmented and very divided at the moment. Many of the groups who are still fighting the Pakistan army are not under the command of Mullah Fazlullah. They're under separate commanders, and this fragmentation has been played up a lot by the Pakistan Army and by the media here. And what this attack is trying to demonstrate is that the Taliban are still one, that they can still mount a very vicious attack in the heart of Peshawar. And remember, this attack took place in the heart of one of the largest cities in Pakistan, which means that they have the capacity to smuggle in arms, ammunition, fighters, and they probably have cells inside the city itself. So I think the consequences of this attack, I think, will be analyzed for many weeks and months to come. And it has been a very complex attack. But yes, I think on the ground, what we are seeing is a shift in the relationship between Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Americans. I think the Pakistanis have made a commitment that this offensive that they have launched is not a sort of two-track policy where they're differentiating between good and bad Taliban, but all the Taliban are being targeted. And I think that is what has been hurting the Taliban, which is why they launched this attack.
I'll broaden the discussion in a moment's time, but I want to stick for a while to the essential message you believe the Taliban are sending out with this attack. You wrote about it in the Financial Times today. It's clearly a message to the army that the Taliban is strong, they can retaliate, they can attack army schools in the center of a military cantonment in one of the bigger cities. Would this attack have rattled the army? Would a message from the Taliban to the army have gone across that worries the army?
Look, I think the Taliban aim was clearly to try and humiliate the army and to demoralize them. But I think given the public response, I can only imagine what the response in the army must be, and that must be a very tough, we will hit you back response. I don't think it will demoralize the army at all. Even though the public here is very shattered, I think there's really now much more a commonality of views and agreement that the Taliban have to be got at. So I don't see this attack as being demoralizing. I think, the other factor in this attack is that given Pashtun culture, and remember, Peshawar is the capital of the Pashtun area in Pakistan, and the Taliban are themselves Pashtun, the Pashtun place a special emphasis on protecting women and children during wartime. This is a tribal society. They fight each other frequently, but there's a part of the culture is to protect women and children. So this attack by Pashtuns on what probably is largely Pashtun children is seen as a especially horrendous attack on Pashtun culture by the Pashtun Taliban. And so again, there I see real horror amongst conservative and traditional Pashtun people and the population that women and children are not even safe. A lot of the teachers in the school were women. The principal was a woman who was shot dead in her room, and other teachers were women who were also killed.
Does this mean, therefore, as a follow-on to the point you just made, that the stock and standing of the militants and these particular Taliban amongst the Pashtuns will actually have sunk badly, that a lot of sympathy and support they may have had, they've now lost as a result of attacking women and children, that this could reverberate badly on them?
I think this will reverberate very badly on them. I think we're seeing the signs of that already around the country. The response today, the whole country was a standstill. Special prayers were held everywhere. Candlelight vigils have been held last night, and again tonight they will be held. So I think, people have been really very badly affected and horrified by this. And I think this is going to deal a blow to many Pakistanis who were actually kind of sympathetic to the Taliban or believed some of the conspiracy theories that these are not Muslims, that these are Hindus or Christians or people of other nationalities who've launching these terrorist attacks. I think it's very clear to those skeptical Pakistanis now that these are Taliban, these are Pashtuns, these are Pakistanis, and they have killed children of their own country.
Now, in your Financial Times article that appeared today, you identified 3 messages that the Taliban is trying to send out. The first was to the army, which we've discussed. The second was a message to Malala Yousafzai, which you mentioned a little while ago, where you said the Taliban rejects the education Malala is advocating, particularly for girls. But there was a third message you believe the Taliban is also sending out. And this is how you put it in your article. You said the ongoing offensive by the Afghan Taliban in Kabul and other cities in Afghanistan is now being matched by a similar offensive in Pakistan. Does that mean that the terror that is experienced in Pakistan and Afghanistan could actually increase substantially, particularly with American and allied troops in Afghanistan coming down to just about 12,500 in January? Is that the third message, that terror will go up in these 2 countries substantially?
I think certainly, you know, what we're seeing in Afghanistan is a stepped up Taliban offensive. Remember, it's winter now, and traditionally the Taliban stop their campaigns in winter. But we've had 12 attacks in Kabul in the space of 2 or 3 weeks, and many attacks outside Kabul. Even today, there's been a major attack on a bank in Helmand province in the south of the country by the Taliban. And also, I think, a message to the Americans that even leaving 12,000 troops compared to 100,000 that they had before, even leaving that number of troops is not acceptable to the Taliban. So, and I think, you know, the Pakistani Taliban are very much aware of what their Afghan brothers are doing, and they want to match it, and they want to show that the Pakistani Taliban are not inactive while their Afghan brothers are carrying out this offensive.
Now, at the press conference which the Prime Minister addressed after the all-parties meeting today in Peshawar, he announced that all the parties together had agreed to set up a committee, and this committee, within a brief 1 week, will come up with a national plan to fight terror. Will that national plan supersede Zarb-e-Azab, or is it intended to add and strengthen to it?
You know, unfortunately, there have been many such attempts. When Nawaz Sharif became Prime Minister last year, he set up a committee. He had many people come in and discuss a whole national security strategy. There was talk about a National Security Council, which would be fully staffed so that it could, with people from intelligence and experts, so that it could deal with terrorism and strategy involved, and nothing happened. You know, at the end of the day, absolutely nothing happened, and the whole idea was left to rot. And I just hope, and in between there have been other attempts to form a national strategy. None of them have worked out. I just hope that this effort now is going to be taken more seriously. Of course, some cynics are saying that, you know, whenever you want to defer something or delay something, you set up a committee. You know, that is a very traditional thing in both India and Pakistan. I just hope that the government does come up with a national strategy. It can't be done in a week. It has to be done more slowly and more methodically.
Okay.
And it has to have the army and the intelligence agencies all fully on board. And it's not clear, frankly, at this stage, whether that is going to happen.
Let's focus briefly on Zarb-e-Azab, which has been in operation for some 5-6 months. It was launched in North Waziristan by the army in June. Writing for the BBC on the 9th of December, you said that the earlier belief that Pakistan was giving refuge and support to Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban, and the second belief that the offensive in North Waziristan has failed to capture or kill any prominent militant leader, both those beliefs, you said, have decisively changed in the last few weeks, particularly after General Raheel Sharif's visit to Washington recently. What are your reasons for saying that this change in perception has happened fairly decisively in the last few weeks?
Well, I think what we have seen in the last few weeks is basically the following. Pakistan has killed a very prominent Al-Qaeda leader. This is the first Al-Qaeda leader that Pakistan has killed in more than 6-7 years. Before, we were actually denying that Al-Qaeda was still based in Pakistan. The Americans followed up by killing another Al-Qaeda leader on Pakistani soil. And since then, General Raheel Sharif has spent 10 days in Washington. He seems to, I think, have convinced the Americans that the army offensive is aimed at all Taliban, not selective Taliban, in which some are let off the hook and others are killed. And that includes the Haqqani network, which has been a bane and a terror for the Afghan government and for the Americans. And what we have seen in response is that the Americans have been using drone attacks against the Pakistani Taliban based in Afghanistan. Now, this is exactly what the Pakistanis have been asking for many months and years. And it never happened before, because clearly the Americans were only willing to do this as a kind of reward or as a kind of incentive if the Pakistanis would go after all the Taliban. So it seems that for the first time, the Pakistanis are going after all the Taliban, and the Americans are now facilitating Pakistan's own war by killing off Pakistani Taliban who are based in Afghanistan. So I think what we're seeing is definitely a shift in attitudes of all three countries.
Let me pick up on your point that the Pakistanis are now going after all Taliban. They're not differentiating between good and bad Taliban. That was a point Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif actually made at that press conference this evening. Are there then chances that this new vigorous approach against the Taliban and against Al-Qaeda will also translate into a similar tough response against groups like the LET and Jaish, which target India?
No, I don't see that happening for the time being, unfortunately. I wish it was so, but I don't think the army, which has something like 140,000 troops now along the border with Afghanistan and taking part in this offensive in North Waziristan, I don't think that they can match this kind of action that they're doing against groups like LET and others. Relations, as you know, with India have been stalled very badly ever since the swearing in of Prime Minister Modi and the meeting with Nawaz Sharif. Since then, relations have gone down. There's been shooting on the border. There's been attempts to disrupt the elections in Kashmir by militant groups. I hope that this gesture now of Prime Minister Modi, the 2-minute silence in Parliament, the 2-minute silence in the Indian schools, and the telephone call between the two Prime Ministers will somehow reinvigorate a dialogue between the two. I think both countries desperately need to talk to each other.
Okay.
And I think, ultimately something will have to be done about the groups in Punjab, not so much at Afghanistan, but more at Kashmir and India. But whether that will take, I don't see that taking the shape of a military offensive. I think it will take the shape more of perhaps a political dialogue and some kind of alternatives being offered to some of these militants, rather than a kind of military offensive. Which would be extremely difficult to do. At the moment, anyway, nothing much is going to happen with the LET, simply because I think the army and the government is too preoccupied with the Taliban on the western border.
You said two very important things. I want to pick up on both of them briefly. First, to do with the LET and Jaish. You're suggesting that whereas the old distinction between good and bad Taliban has ended, there is now going to be a new distinction between bad Taliban altogether and acceptable or good Hafiz Saeed, acceptable or good LET, acceptable or good Jaish. That attitude and differentiation will continue now between Taliban on the one hand and LET, Jaish and Hafiz Saeed on the other, who all target India.
No, I don't think you can make that differentiation that somehow LET is going to be termed as good Taliban. I think there's an acknowledgement that Asians within India clearly it can't happen without something being done about LAT. So, I think there's an acknowledgement in the military, in the political circles, that clearly we have to deal with all the groups in Pakistan because they all pose a potential threat. Some pose a direct threat, like the Taliban. Others pose perhaps a more long-term threat. But I think there is this acknowledgement. And remember that, the previous military commander, General Kayani, more than 2 years ago, said that the real threat to Pakistan is not India, but it is terrorism. Now, that was a very significant statement. He never did anything about it. He never launched any offensive in Waziristan or anywhere else. It's been left now to his successor to implement that philosophy. If that philosophy is true, then we have to consider all the extremist groups as being a potential threat to the nation state of Pakistan. And, but clearly you can't deal with all of them in one go. They have to be staggered, and different groups will need different responses.
And so the response to the LET will be later, and secondary, the response to Taliban is first. A quick yes or no to that?
Yes, I think that's probably true.
One other thing, you mentioned the response from India, the fact that there was a 2-minute silence in Parliament, in both houses of Parliament. All Indian schools had a 2-minute silence first thing in the morning at their assemblies. The Prime Minister rang up your Prime Minister and expressed his sympathy and support. And then, in fact, in a statement the Indian Prime Minister has issued, he says that this is a moment for our two countries to join hands to decisively and comprehensively defeat terrorism. How has this response altogether taken from India gone down in Pakistan?
I think people are still digesting what he said. I mean, remember that how low the relations have been in the past few months, and this is the first, if you like, positive gesture that Pakistanis have heard from Prime Minister Modi. So I think, we haven't had yet a reaction from the Foreign Office, from the government. Normally there would be a very prompt reaction. I think the government is digesting this and see.
Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. Indian schools in both houses of Parliament observed a 2-minute silence today in solidarity with Pakistan after yesterday's horrendous terrorist attack in Peshawar. This was after Prime Minister Modi rang up his Pakistani counterpart to personally express his sympathy and concern. The Prime Minister also called for both countries to join hands to Pakistan on the brink. Ahmed Rashid. Ahmed Rashid, let's start with yesterday's horrific attack on the Army Public School in Peshawar, which left 141 people dead, including 132 children. The Pakistani newspaper Dawn says several bodies were decapitated. Many of the young children were shot straight in the head. In your estimation, is this the worst massacre of children in the history of Islamic terrorism?
Well, sir, I don't think anybody's surprised because all the major Taliban attacks have been inside jobs, in the sense that they attacked the general headquarters of the army, they've attacked the naval headquarters, they've attacked ISI offices, and they always seem to have had, is not a surprise, but of course it is devastating to know that the Taliban's intelligence is still very great, and they have access to all these institutions.
Are you suggesting that, in fact,
there was an attack on the school by the Chechens in 2004 in Chechnya, but the casualties in Afghanistan and Pakistan for the last 10, 12 years, we haven't seen anything like this.
Now, the Tehreek-e-Taliban has claimed responsibility, And it emerges that they seem to know the layout of this school very well. For instance, they knew the principal's room, they knew the auditorium, they knew the canteen. Are you surprised by how well prepared they were and how carefully planned this operation was?
No.
Decisively and comprehensively defeat terror. So how should we interpret this response from India? That's the discussion in part 2. But first, was yesterday's attack on the army school in Peshawar one more consequence of Pakistan's failure to effectively tackle the Taliban, or is it a response to Operation Zarb-e-Azab, which over the last 5 months has hit the Taliban hard, forcing this desperate attack? And beyond that, what message is the Taliban trying to send by this attack? Those are two of the questions I shall put to the world's greatest authority on the Taliban, the renowned author of The Taliban, as well as